Imagine climbing into a bomber where a single bullet could turn your aircraft into a fireball, where hitting the wing meant instant death, where your fuel tanks had no protection whatsoever. American pilots in World War II couldn't believe what they were seeing. Japanese bomber crews were flying aircraft with completely exposed fuel systems. No armor. No safety features. Nothing. Just thin metal between thousands of gallons of fuel and enemy guns. This wasn't an accident or a mistake. It was intentional. The Betty bomber was designed this way on purpose, and the reason why reveals one of the most shocking decisions in aviation history. When American intelligence officer Major Frank McCoy climbed inside a captured Japanese bomber in January 1945, he thought he had made an error. He checked again. Then a third time. The fuel tanks were totally unprotected. Just bare aluminum. He had examined dozens of crashed enemy aircraft across the Pacific, but nothing prepared him for this discovery. Every American bomber had multiple layers of protection. Special rubber that sealed bullet holes automatically. Armor plating around vital systems. Fire suppression equipment. The Japanese had none of it. Zero protection. This single aircraft would change everything Americans thought they knew about their enemy. The Betty bomber earned terrifying nicknames from American fighter pilots. The Flying Lighter. The One-Shot Lighter. The Flying Zippo. All for the same horrifying reason. Hit this aircraft anywhere along the fuselage or wings and it exploded into flames. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. In the first year of the war, this same aircraft was absolutely devastating. It sank British battleships. It destroyed American air bases. It could fly further than any bomber in the world. So what happened? How did Japan's most important bomber go from unstoppable weapon to flying death trap? The answer lies in decisions made years before the war even started, and those decisions would cost thousands of Japanese airmen their lives. Let's go back to where this story really begins. December 8, 1941. While smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor, 82 Betty bombers took off from bases on Formosa, which is now Taiwan. Their target was Clark Field in the Philippines, the main American air base in the region. The Japanese formation arrived at noon, flying at 20,000 feet, completely beyond the reach of American anti-aircraft guns. What happened next was devastating. In just 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines was wiped out. 17 B-17 flying fortresses sat on the ground. 12 were destroyed. Nearly every P-40 fighter was reduced to burning wreckage. The Betty bombers flew home untouched. Not a single one was shot down. American Lieutenant James Harrington watched from a bomb shelter as the Japanese formation withdrew. He later wrote in his combat report about how perfectly they executed the attack. The formation flew at high altitude, totally beyond American reach. Then Japanese fighters swept in at treetop level and destroyed everything that survived the bombing. Not a single American aircraft got airborne. The few fighters that managed to take off arrived too late, finding only empty sky. The Japanese had demonstrated something remarkable. Their bombers had struck from bases 460 miles away, a feat no American bomber could match at that stage of the war. 2 days later, the Betty proved it could do even more. 26 of these bombers joined an attack on British warships. The targets were massive. HMS Prince of Wales, a brand new battleship. HMS Repulse, a powerful battle cruiser. These were capital ships, the pride of the Royal Navy. The Betty bombers carried torpedoes specifically designed for this mission. Each torpedo weighed 840 kilograms with a 205-kilogram warhead. They were designed for shallow water operations, able to strike ships even in coastal waters. The attack began at approximately 20 past noon. The Betty bombers approached in coordinated waves with precision that shocked British observers. The torpedo attacks focused on the two capital ships with devastating accuracy. Prince of Wales, displacing 43,000 tons and representing the newest generation of British naval power, took at least 6 torpedo hits along with damage from level bombers. The underwater explosions ripped massive holes in the ship's hull. Flooding overwhelmed damage control efforts. The battleship began listing severely. Repulse absorbed at least 4 torpedo hits while attempting to evade the attacking aircraft. The ship's anti-aircraft fire claimed several Japanese aircraft, but could not prevent the coordinated torpedo runs from finding their targets. The cumulative damage proved fatal. Both capital ships capsized and sank within hours of the attack. Prince of Wales went down first. Repulse followed minutes later. 841 British sailors died. The survivors were rescued by escorting destroyers. The engagement lasted less than 2 hours from first contact to final sinking. For the first time in naval history, capital ships actively defending themselves had been sunk solely by air power while in the open sea. The Betty bomber had achieved what naval theorists had debated for decades. British naval superiority in Asian waters had been shattered in 90 minutes. Through the first half of 1942, Betty bombers seemed unstoppable. They hit Darwin, Australia from bases 1,500 miles away. They struck Port Moresby across mountain ranges in New Guinea. They attacked Guadalcanal from airfields over 600 miles distant. The range of this aircraft gave Japanese forces a huge advantage. American fighters couldn't intercept bombers departing from such distant bases. Allied airfields came under attack from Japanese positions that were themselves beyond Allied striking range. The Betty could hit you, but you couldn't hit back. This asymmetry meant Japanese forces could attack whenever they wanted, while Allied forces struggled to respond. Betty bombers participated in virtually every Japanese offensive operation across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. They struck targets in the Philippines, Malaya, Netherlands, East Indies, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. They supported naval operations throughout the theater. They performed reconnaissance missions that exceeded the range of any Allied aircraft. The Betty became the symbol of Japanese air power's reach and effectiveness. But this dominance had a hidden weakness. The Betty's success depended entirely on facing limited opposition. When it could strike without interception, when it could approach at high altitude beyond anti-aircraft range, when it could deliver weapons and leave before fighters arrived, the aircraft was incredibly effective. These perfect conditions existed during the first months of the war when Allied air strength remained scattered and weak. However, everything was about to change. By mid-1942, American fighter strength was growing rapidly. Older Wildcat fighters gave way to superior Hellcats and Corsairs. Pilot training improved. Combat experience accumulated. Tactical methods evolved. And Betty crews began reporting something disturbing. They were suffering terrible losses. The shift became undeniable on August 8, 1942. 23 Betty bombers departed Rabaul to attack American positions on Guadalcanal. American fighters intercepted them over nearby waters. In the battle that followed, 18 of the 23 bombers were shot down. Roughly 120 airmen died in a single mission. This became the single worst loss for the Betty during the entire campaign. Fighter pilots reported the same thing across every engagement. The Betty exploded into flames with just a few hits. 2 or 3 bullets anywhere along the fuselage or wings produced catastrophic results. The aircraft earned grim nicknames that spread rapidly through American squadrons. All references to the Betty's terrifying tendency to bloom into fire from battle damage. Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn arrived at Guadalcanal in October 1942, commanding a squadron of Corsair fighters. His experience with Betty bombers was typical of American pilots by that point in the war. He later stated that the first time his squadron caught a Betty formation, they couldn't believe how easily the bombers went down. Hit them anywhere along the fuselage or wings and they exploded. American pilots actively hunted Bettys, recognizing them as among the most vulnerable targets in Pacific skies. But nobody fully understood why the Betty was so vulnerable until American forces began capturing intact examples. The first major breakthrough came in November 1942 when Australian forces overran Japanese airfields at Buna in Papua New Guinea. Among the abandoned aircraft, intelligence teams discovered Betty bombers with various levels of damage. Initial examinations confirmed what pilots had reported in combat. The fuel tanks had absolutely no protection. Engineers from the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit conducted the first detailed analysis. They opened the wing access panels and found fuel cells with no protective measures whatsoever. Thin, aluminum construction. No rubber sealant layer. No protective coating. No fire suppression systems beyond basic handheld extinguishers. Multiple Betty bombers examined at Buna showed identical characteristics. This was not battle damage or field modification. This was standard Japanese design. The implications were staggering. By 1942, every American bomber featured self-sealing fuel tanks as standard equipment. The B-17 Flying Fortress had them from early models onward. The B-24 Liberator featured them from the prototype stage. Even fighter aircraft like the P-38 and P-47 had protected fuel systems. Self-sealing tanks used layers of rubber compound that swelled when fuel leaked through bullet holes, automatically sealing the puncture and preventing fuel loss and fire. The technology added significant weight to aircraft, but it dramatically improved crew survival rates. American military doctrine considered this weight penalty absolutely essential and non-negotiable. Yet here was Japan's primary land-based bomber, produced in thousands, operating across the entire Pacific theater, with fuel tanks offering zero protection. The weight saved by eliminating self-sealing systems, armor plating, and fire suppression equipment was immediately apparent. But the cost in crew lives was becoming equally obvious in loss statistics that mounted with every engagement. The captured Betty at Clark Field in January 1945 provided the most complete analysis. Major McCoy and his team spent 3 weeks dismantling and documenting every system. Their report was classified secret and distributed to all Allied air forces. It detailed specifications that explained both the Betty's extraordinary capabilities and its catastrophic vulnerabilities. The specifications revealed an aircraft optimized ruthlessly for range and speed. Empty weight was just 6,741 kilograms. Remarkably light for a bomber of this size. Maximum takeoff weight reached 9,500 kilograms. Fuel capacity was 4,780 liters distributed across 8 unprotected tanks, 4 in each wing. These tanks were positioned in the wing's center section where they were most vulnerable to combat damage. Top speed reached 428 kilometers per hour. Maximum range was an incredible 6,034 kilometers. That's over 3,700 miles. Service ceiling was 8,500 meters. The crew consisted of 7 members including pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 2 gunners. The fuel system design was particularly revealing. The 8 tanks were arranged in 4 groups of 2, positioned along the wing where it joined the fuselage. This placement maximized fuel capacity by using the thickest part of the wing structure. But it also positioned the tanks directly in the path of enemy fire during combat. Any attack from the side or below would inevitably strike fuel tanks. The aluminum construction provided no protection. The absence of self-sealing compounds meant even small holes would leak fuel continuously. American engineers calculated that the weight saved by eliminating protection systems exceeded 500 kilograms per aircraft. This weight savings translated directly into additional fuel capacity and extended range. But the cost in vulnerability was equally calculable. Combat reports showed that Betty bombers hit anywhere in the wing area exploded with near certainty. The unprotected tanks created what engineers called a critical failure point. A single system whose destruction guaranteed loss of the entire aircraft. These numbers told the story of design choices made back in September 1937 when the Japanese Navy issued requirements that would define the Betty's entire existence. They wanted top speed of nearly 400 kilometers per hour, cruising altitude of 3,000 meters, range of over 4,700 kilometers when unloaded, or 3,700 kilometers carrying 800 kilograms of bombs or torpedoes. The requirements reflected Japanese naval strategy in the late 1930s. Japan's empire stretched across vast Pacific distances. Naval bases were separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. The Navy needed bombers capable of striking enemy positions far beyond the range of carrier aircraft. Bombers that could operate from land bases to support naval operations across the entire theater. Existing Japanese bombers fell far short of these requirements. The older model bomber then in service had a maximum range of approximately 3,000 kilometers. American bombers like the B-17 had even more limited range in their early variants. No bomber in service anywhere in the world in 1937 could strike targets at the distances Japanese planners envisioned. From Formosa to the Philippines was 460 miles. From Rabaul to Guadalcanal was 600 miles. From Japanese home islands to potential targets across the Pacific could be thousands of miles. The bomber that could meet these requirements would give Japan strategic reach that no other nation possessed. But the requirements also reflected assumptions about future warfare that would prove catastrophically wrong. Japanese planners assumed that surprise and initiative would provide protection for long-range bombers. They assumed that enemy fighter opposition would be limited by range and numbers. They assumed that the war would be decided quickly before enemy industrial capacity could generate overwhelming force. Every single assumption would prove false. The man tasked with achieving the impossible was Kiro Honjo. He led the Mitsubishi design team after taking over from the previous chief engineer. Honjo had studied bomber design at Junkers in Germany during the early 1930s, learning European engineering principles and manufacturing techniques before returning to Japan. He understood immediately that meeting the Navy's requirements would demand compromises that Western air forces would never accept. Honjo assembled a team of engineers at Mitsubishi's facilities in Nagoya to tackle the design challenges. The team analyzed every aspect of bomber design, calculating weight budgets for every single component and system. They studied existing bombers from multiple nations, identifying where weight could be reduced without compromising structural integrity. They experimented with new construction techniques and materials that might offer weight savings. The mathematics were brutally simple. To achieve the required range, the aircraft needed massive fuel capacity. Each liter of aviation fuel weighed roughly 0.8 kilograms. 4,780 liters of fuel meant approximately 3,800 kilograms of fuel weight at full load. To achieve the required speed with this fuel load, the aircraft needed minimal weight. Every kilogram added to the empty weight reduced either range or payload capacity. These two requirements existed in direct opposition. Fuel was heavy. Protection systems were heavy. Armor plating would require hundreds of kilograms to protect crew positions and vital systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks added substantial weight through the rubber compounds and additional structure required. Fire suppression systems added weight. Redundant safety measures added weight. The cumulative weight of adequate protection would prevent achieving the required performance. Honjo made the decision that would define the Betty throughout its service life. Protection would be sacrificed for performance. The fuel tanks would be unprotected aluminum construction. No self-sealing compounds. No armor plating around fuel cells. No fire suppression systems beyond basic fire extinguishers. No redundant safety measures. Every kilogram saved would be invested in fuel capacity, range, and achieving the Navy's performance specifications. The decision was not made lightly. Honjo understood the risks. His team calculated the vulnerabilities that unprotected fuel tanks would create. They knew that combat damage to the wings would likely prove catastrophic. But they also knew that the Navy's requirements could not be met any other way with available technology in the late 1930s. The choice was between an aircraft that met performance specifications with known vulnerabilities, or an aircraft that failed to meet requirements but offered better protection. The Navy had demanded performance above all else. Honjo delivered exactly what they asked for. The first Betty prototype flew on October 23, 1939. The aircraft met every performance requirement the Navy had specified. Speed exceeded expectations. Range surpassed projections. Payload capacity satisfied operational needs. The test flights demonstrated that the design worked. The bomber could achieve the extraordinary range the Navy demanded. It could carry meaningful weapons loads across vast distances. It could operate at speeds that made interception difficult under the conditions planners anticipated. The bomber entered production with Mitsubishi building the aircraft at plants in Nagoya. Initial production models began reaching operational units in April 1941. By December 1941, approximately 180 Bettys were in service with the Japanese Navy. These aircraft would form the backbone of Japanese land-based air power throughout the Pacific War. Crew training accelerated through 1941 as more aircraft became available. Pilots learned to handle the bomber's characteristics. Navigators mastered long-distance navigation techniques essential for missions across vast ocean expanses. Bombardiers and torpedo specialists practiced attack profiles against naval and ground targets. The Betty's combat debut at Clark Field and against the British warships demonstrated the wisdom of Honjo's design priorities under the specific conditions of early 1942. When facing limited opposition, when achieving surprise, when operating beyond the range of enemy fighters, the Betty was devastatingly effective. Its range allowed strikes from bases that enemies considered safe from attack. Its speed permitted rapid penetration of target areas and quick withdrawal. Its payload delivered meaningful damage against strategic targets. But these advantages depended entirely on the assumption that Betty formations would face minimal opposition. The aircraft was designed for an operational environment where Japanese forces maintained air superiority, or at least parity. It was optimized for conditions where interception would be rare and fighter opposition limited. These conditions existed briefly in the opening months of the war. They would not last. The moment American fighter strength increased, the moment interception became routine, the moment sustained combat became inevitable, every design choice that prioritized range over protection became a death sentence for crews. The Guadalcanal campaign exposed the fundamental flaw in the Betty's design philosophy with brutal clarity. From August through October 1942, more than 100 Betty bombers were lost with their crews in sustained combat that Japanese air forces could not sustain. That single mission on August 8 alone destroyed 18 of 23 aircraft with approximately 120 aviators killed. The pattern repeated with brutal consistency throughout the campaign. Betty formations would depart from Rabaul, fly 600 miles to Guadalcanal, engage American fighters, and suffer catastrophic losses. August 9 saw more bombers lost. August 10 brought additional losses. By the end of August, entire air groups had been effectively destroyed as operational units. September brought no relief. Betty formations continued striking American positions at Guadalcanal and American fighters continued destroying them in overwhelming numbers. The mathematics were inescapable. Japanese forces needed to strike American positions to contest control of the island. Betty bombers provided the only means of delivering meaningful strike capability from Rabaul. But every mission resulted in losses that could not be replaced. Japanese industry could not produce replacement aircraft and trained crews fast enough to offset the losses. Each mission depleted available strength. Each engagement reduced the number of bombers available for subsequent operations. October saw the pattern continue. American fighter strength increased as more squadrons arrived at Henderson Field. Pilot quality improved as combat experience accumulated. Tactical doctrine evolved to exploit Betty vulnerabilities more effectively. American pilots learned the most efficient attack angles. They discovered that hits to the wing routes produced the most reliable kills. They developed tactics specifically for Betty interception that maximized kill rates while minimizing risk to American fighters. Japanese losses accelerated even as the number of bombers available for missions declined. By November, when the Guadalcanal campaign effectively ended with Japanese withdrawal, Betty losses exceeded 100 aircraft. Crew casualties approached 700 men dead. The exchange rate was completely unsustainable. Japan's most capable land-based bomber had been rendered obsolete by its own vulnerabilities, transformed from a feared weapon into what American pilots called easy meat. Japanese planners had expected losses. All military operations involve casualties. War inherently involves risk and death. But the scale of Betty losses exceeded every projection. The unprotected fuel tanks that permitted 6,000-kilometer range also guaranteed that any hit to wings or fuselage would likely prove fatal. There was no middle ground. No wounded bombers limping home with damage. No aircraft surviving to fight another day after taking hits. Betty bombers either returned untouched or exploded in flames. There was no in-between. By mid-1943, Japanese engineers recognized that modifications were essential. The losses could not continue at these rates without destroying Japanese air power entirely. Starting with the 663rd aircraft produced in March 1943, 30mm rubber sheets were installed beneath wing surfaces where fuel tanks were located. These sheets were not true self-sealing tanks like American bombers used. They were a compromise measure, adding minimal weight while providing limited protection against fuel leakage. The modification reduced top speed by 9 km per hour. Maximum range decreased by 315 km. But crew survival rates showed no significant improvement. Combat reports from units operating the modified aircraft indicated little change in loss rates. The rubber sheets could slow fuel leakage from small caliber hits. They could reduce the rate at which fuel escaped from minor punctures. They could not prevent fires from larger caliber rounds or cannon shells. They could not stop explosions when tracer rounds ignited fuel vapor inside the tanks. The fundamental vulnerability remained unchanged. Japanese designers attempted more comprehensive protection with a new model introduced in October 1944. This variant featured actual self-sealing fuel tanks similar to those used in American bombers. The tanks incorporated rubber compounds that swelled to seal punctures. The capacity was reduced to 4,490 liters to accommodate the leak-blocking material. The modification reduced maximum range to 3,640 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the original model. Approximately 60 of these improved aircraft were produced by war's end. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect the Betty's combat record. By late 1944, American air superiority was so complete that no level of fuel tank protection would have permitted Betty bombers to operate effectively. The war's outcome had already been determined. American forces controlled the skies. Japanese air power had been ground down through years of attrition warfare that Japan could not win. The Betty's vulnerability became so notorious that it played a role in one of the war's most significant events. On April 18, 1943, the Betty bomber became the instrument of Admiral Yamamoto's death in an engagement that demonstrated both American intelligence capabilities and the aircraft's fatal weaknesses. American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications indicating that Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18. The admiral, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and Japan's most capable naval commander, would travel aboard a Betty bomber with a fighter escort. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters were assigned to intercept the flight, though only 16 actually flew the mission after mechanical problems grounded 2 aircraft. The mission required extraordinary precision. The P-38S would fly over 400 miles at wave-top height to avoid radar detection. They would navigate across open ocean without landmarks. They would arrive at exactly the calculated intercept point at exactly the calculated time. Any error in navigation or timing would result in mission failure. The intercept had to occur within a narrow window when Yamamoto's aircraft would be vulnerable. The P-38S departed Guadalcanal at 7:25 in the morning. They flew at 50 feet above the ocean for over 400 miles, maintaining strict radio silence. Navigation was by dead reckoning and precise timing. The formation arrived at the calculated intercept point with precision that would become legendary in aviation history. At 9:34 in the morning, exactly on schedule and exactly 1 minute ahead of the calculated intercept time, the P-38S spotted Yamamoto's formation. 2 Betty bombers flying at low altitude with 60 fighters as escort. 2 P-38S broke from the formation to engage the bombers while others held off the 0 fighters. 1 P-38 engaged the lead Betty bomber which carried Admiral Yamamoto. The bomber took hits to the wing area where the unprotected fuel tanks were located. The aircraft exploded in flames and crashed in the jungle below. Yamamoto's body was recovered the following day. He had been killed by injuries sustained during the crash. The second Betty bomber also crashed, killing all aboard including staff officers traveling with Yamamoto. The operation demonstrated multiple aspects of Allied superiority by this stage of the war. American signals intelligence had intercepted and decoded Japanese communications. American planning had calculated intercept timing with 1-minute precision over 400 miles of ocean. American fighters had executed the mission flawlessly despite extraordinary navigation challenges. And the Betty bomber's vulnerabilities had guaranteed that successful interception would be fatal. There was no possibility of Yamamoto's bomber surviving once it came under attack. The unprotected fuel tanks ensured that any damage would be catastrophic. The Betty's vulnerability reached its most dramatic demonstration on March 21, 1945. 18 Betty bombers took off from Kanoya Air Base, each carrying a special weapon beneath its fuselage. These were piloted rocket bombs designed for suicide attacks against American ships. The weapon was called the Oka, meaning cherry blossom. Each Oka had a 1,200-kilogram warhead and a rocket motor capable of propelling it at speeds exceeding 650 kilometers per hour. The mission required the Betty bombers to fly within 20 kilometers of their targets before releasing the Oka aircraft. The Oka pilot would then ignite the rocket motor and dive toward American ships. The warhead's 1,200 kilograms of explosives would destroy any vessel it struck. But the mission depended entirely on the Betty bombers surviving long enough to reach release range. The formation departed at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. The 18 Betty bombers flew in tight formation with fighter escort heading toward American naval forces off Okinawa. Each bomber carried an Oka weapon beneath its fuselage, adding substantial weight and drag that reduced speed and maneuverability. The bombers were even more vulnerable than usual, unable to evade or maneuver effectively while carrying the external loads. American radar detected the formation at approximately 100 miles distance. Hellcat fighters were scrambled to intercept. The Hellcats reached the Japanese formation well before it approached release range for the Oka weapons. In the engagement that followed, American fighters systematically destroyed the entire formation. The Betty bombers, already vulnerable under normal circumstances, proved completely helpless while carrying the external weapons. The additional weight prevented evasive maneuvers. The drag reduced speed. The unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed that any hit would be fatal. One by one, the bombers exploded and fell into the ocean. Not a single Betty bomber survived to reach release range. Not a single Oka weapon was launched against American ships. 137 bomber crew members and 15 Oka pilots died in the attack. The mission represented the ultimate expression of the Betty's fundamental flaw. An aircraft designed to deliver weapons to distant targets could not survive to deliver those weapons when facing prepared opposition. The extraordinary range that made the mission theoretically possible meant nothing when the aircraft exploded before reaching weapon release range. The final mission flown by Betty bombers came on August 19, 1945, for days after the Emperor announced Japan's surrender. 2 white-painted Betty bombers with green crosses departed a Japanese airfield carrying representatives to discuss surrender terms with Allied forces. The aircraft were given call signs Bataan 1 and Bataan 2. They flew to an island where the Japanese delegation transferred to an American transport for the journey to Manila. The symbolism was profound and deliberate. The white paint and green crosses indicated peaceful intent, transforming the bombers from weapons of war into vehicles of diplomacy. The call signs referenced Bataan, the location where American forces had surrendered to Japan in April 1942, one of the most devastating defeats in American military history. Now, 3 years later, aircraft bearing those call signs carried Japan's surrender delegation. Lieutenant Dino Sudo piloted one of the surrender aircraft, a transport variant converted from the bomber airframe. The transport variants retained the Betty's distinctive cylindrical fuselage and wing configuration, but carried passengers and cargo rather than weapons. The crew wore dress uniforms rather than flight suits. The aircraft carried no weapons, no ammunition, no military equipment of any kind beyond what was necessary for flight. The flight covered approximately 1,000 kilometers, well within the Betty's range even in transport configuration. American fighters escorted the White Betty bombers throughout their flight, ensuring they remained on the prescribed course. The escort was both protective and supervisory, guaranteeing safe passage while preventing any deviation from planned routes. The White Betty bombers with green crosses became the final image of the aircraft that had opened the Pacific War at Clark Field in December 1941. The circle was complete. The bomber that had destroyed American air power in the Philippines in the war's first hours now carried Japan's surrender delegation in the war's final days. The aircraft that had symbolized Japanese air power's reach and effectiveness now symbolized Japan's defeat and submission to Allied terms. The Betty's production statistics reflect both the aircraft's importance to Japanese operations and the terrible cost of its design philosophy. Total production reached approximately 2,414 aircraft across all variants, though some sources cite figures as high as 2,435 when including all prototypes and subtypes. The variation in total numbers reflects different methods of counting prototypes, subtypes, and transport variants. The original model comprised approximately 1,172 aircraft produced from 1941 through early 1943. This variant featured the original unprotected fuel tank design with capacity of 4,780 liters. Top speed reached 428 kilometers per hour. Maximum range of 6,034 kilometers made it the longest-ranged bomber in service anywhere in the world when it entered service. But the complete absence of protection systems made it catastrophically vulnerable once American fighter strength increased. The improved model with increased fuel capacity and slightly higher speed accounted for approximately 1,142 examples produced from 1943 through 1945. This variant increased fuel capacity to 6,490 liters, extending maximum range even further. Top speed increased slightly to 437 kilometers per hour. But the improved model retained the fundamental vulnerability of unprotected fuel tanks. The modifications improved performance without addressing survivability. The only variant with actual self-sealing fuel tanks saw production begin in October 1944, but only 60 to 91 aircraft were completed by war's end depending on the source. The self-sealing tanks reduced fuel capacity to 4,490 liters to accommodate the leak-blocking material. Maximum range decreased to 3,640 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the original model. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect combat outcomes. The transport variant converted from bomber airframes added another 30 aircraft. These transport versions carried passengers and cargo rather than weapons, serving in liaison and communications roles. One of these transport variants was used for the surrender aircraft in August 1945. Production continued through August 1945 with final aircraft completed just days before Japan's surrender. Mitsubishi factories produced Betty bombers at peak rates of approximately 100 aircraft per month during 1943. Production decreased in 1944 and 1945 as Allied bombing disrupted Japanese industry and as resources were diverted to fighter production for homeland defense. Strategic bombing campaigns targeted Japanese industrial centers, destroying factories and disrupting supply chains. Raw materials became increasingly scarce as Allied submarines cut maritime supply routes. These production numbers made the Betty one of Japan's most numerous bombers, exceeded only by some fighter types in total production. Over 4 years of war, Mitsubishi delivered approximately 2,400 aircraft to Japanese Navy units across the Pacific theater. The bombers served in every major campaign, participated in every significant naval engagement, and struck targets across distances spanning thousands of kilometers. But production statistics tell only part of the story. Loss rates tell the rest. Very few Betty bombers survived to war's end. The overwhelming majority were destroyed in combat, consumed by the fires that the unprotected fuel tanks made inevitable. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, only a handful of operational Betty bombers remained in service. The aircraft that had numbered in hundreds in 1942 had been reduced to dozens by attrition that no amount of production could replace. The casualty statistics among Betty crews were similarly devastating. Exact numbers remain difficult to verify from available records, as Japanese military documentation was often incomplete and much was destroyed in the war's final days. But what is certain is that thousands of Japanese aircrew died in Betty bombers. Their deaths were made nearly inevitable by the aircraft's fundamental vulnerabilities. The unprotected fuel tanks created conditions where survival depended entirely on avoiding combat damage. Once hit, Betty bombers rarely survived. Once on fire, they never survived. Flames spread rapidly through the aircraft. The fuel vapor inside the tanks ignited explosively. The thin aluminum structure provided no barrier to fire propagation. Crew members had little time to escape. Parachutes offered limited salvation when aircraft exploded at low altitude or over water far from friendly territory. The crews understood these odds and flew anyway because military discipline and cultural values demanded that they accept the risks regardless of consequences. Japanese military culture emphasized duty, sacrifice, and obedience to orders above personal survival. Airmen were taught that dying in service to the emperor was the highest honor. This cultural framework made it possible for crews to continue flying missions despite horrific loss rates. Surviving Betty crews were unanimous in their assessment. The aircraft's unprotected fuel tanks made survival a matter of pure chance. No amount of skill, no tactical innovation, no courage could compensate for the fundamental vulnerability built into every Betty. Evasive maneuvers might help avoid initial hits, but once a bomber was hit, the outcome was predetermined. Experience counted for little when a single bullet in the wrong place meant instant death. One former crew member, Flight Petty Officer Masayuki Ikeda, who completed 28 combat missions before transfer to training duties, offered a direct summary. The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to fly it. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do. His words captured the fundamental tragedy of the Betty bomber. It was an engineering marvel that achieved extraordinary performance at the cost of crew survival. The comparison with Allied bomber protection systems highlights the stark difference in design philosophy between Japanese and American approaches to military aviation. The B-17 Flying Fortress featured comprehensive protection systems. Armor plating protected pilot and co-pilot seats with steel plates ranging from 6 mm to 8 mm thick. Armored bulkheads protected crew positions throughout the fuselage, compartmentalizing the aircraft to prevent damage from spreading. The bombardier position featured armored glass capable of stopping small arms fire. Waist gunner positions included protective shields. Self-sealing fuel tanks were standard from early models onward, introduced in 1941. The B-25 Mitchell incorporated similar comprehensive protection. Pilot and co-pilot seats featured armor backing. Fuel tanks included self-sealing compounds from early production runs. Additional armor protected vital systems and crew positions. The B-25's empty weight of approximately 9,100 kilograms reflected the substantial weight penalty of protection systems, roughly 2,000 kilograms heavier than the Betty despite similar size and role. The weight penalty for Allied protection systems was substantial and consciously accepted as necessary. American military planners calculated that trained crews were more valuable than aircraft. Losing a bomber was expensive. Losing a trained crew was catastrophic. Each crew member represented months or years of training. Pilots required extensive flight instruction. Navigators needed specialized training in celestial navigation and dead reckoning. Bombardiers trained on complex bomb sites. Radio operators learned communications procedures. Gunners practiced aerial gunnery techniques. Replacing aircraft was relatively straightforward for American industry. Factories could produce bombers by the thousands. Replacing experienced crews was far more difficult and time-consuming. Therefore, American doctrine prioritized crew protection even at significant cost in aircraft performance. The logic was simple and compelling. Protected crews survived to fly again. Surviving crews accumulated combat experience. Experienced crews were more effective in combat. More effective crews achieved better mission results with lower losses. American studies during the war demonstrated the effectiveness of crew protection measures with statistical precision. Body armor reduced deaths from chest wounds by more than 75%. Flak jackets and armor plating stopped shell fragments that would otherwise prove fatal. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire-related casualties by similar margins. Aircraft equipped with protected fuel systems showed survival rates 3 to 4 times higher than unprotected aircraft when damaged in combat. Protected crew positions increased survival rates in damaged aircraft by providing shielding from shell fragments and small arms fire. Armor prevented wounds from defensive fire during attack runs. Armored glass prevented pilot casualties from head-on attacks. Bulkheads compartmentalized the fuselage, preventing fire or damage in one section from spreading throughout the aircraft. If fire broke out in one area, bulkheads contained it long enough for crews to fight the blaze or abandon the aircraft. The comprehensive approach to crew protection reflected American doctrine that treated aircrew as valuable assets requiring preservation. This philosophy permeated every aspect of American aircraft design. Every system included redundancy. Every vital component had backup alternatives. Every crew position incorporated protection appropriate to the threats faced. The weight cost for this protection exceeded 1,000 pounds in most American bombers, but American industrial capacity permitted this weight penalty without sacrificing production numbers. American factories produced over 12,000 B-17 bombers and nearly 10,000 B-24 Liberators during the war. Additional thousands of B-25 medium bombers, B-29 Superfortresses, and other types rolled off production lines in quantities that overwhelmed Axis forces. The production capacity meant that American forces could field large numbers of protected bombers without compromising capability. Heavy bombers struck targets across Europe and Asia. Medium bombers supported tactical operations. Light bombers and attack aircraft provided close air support. American air power grew continuously throughout the war, while Japanese air strength declined through attrition. Japanese doctrine reached fundamentally different conclusions. The Betty's design reflected a calculation that range and striking power outweighed crew survival. This philosophy assumed that achieving surprise and maintaining initiative would provide sufficient protection. It assumed that enemy opposition would remain limited by distance, numbers, and capability. It assumed that the war would be short and decisive, won before enemy industrial advantages could come into play. All these assumptions proved catastrophically wrong within the first year of war. By mid-1942, American fighter strength increased to levels that made Betty interception routine rather than exceptional. By late 1942, American pilots had learned to exploit every Betty vulnerability, developing tactics specifically designed to maximize kill rates against these bombers. By 1943, Betty formations suffered such devastating losses that missions became suicide operations in all but name. By 1944, Betty bombers could barely operate in daylight against American opposition without suffering near total losses. The mathematics of the Betty's war were written in fire and loss. Every advantage that made the aircraft formidable in early 1942 became irrelevant once sustained combat began. Range meant nothing when bombers exploded before reaching targets. Superior range could not compensate for inability to survive interception. Speed meant nothing when fighters could intercept from distant bases with radar warning. A few minutes of speed advantage meant nothing against fighters that knew you were coming. Payload meant nothing when formations were destroyed before weapon release. The most powerful weapons were useless if they never reached their targets. The examination of the captured bomber at Clark Field in January 1945 revealed the complete story. The unprotected fuel tanks that shocked Major McCoy were not an oversight, not a temporary expedient, not a design failure in the conventional sense. They were the deliberate choice of engineers who believed range mattered more than survival. They were the logical consequence of requirements that demanded maximum performance with minimum weight. Japanese designers had created exactly what their specifications demanded. An aircraft with extraordinary range and speed, built with minimal weight, optimized for the mission requirements they received in 1937. The tanks were unprotected because protection would have prevented achieving the required performance with available technology. The decision made perfect sense within the constraints of late 1930s technology and the assumptions about future warfare that Japanese planners held. But those assumptions collapsed under the reality of sustained combat against an opponent with unlimited industrial capacity and growing technological advantage. The war did not end quickly. Surprise did not provide lasting advantage. Enemy opposition grew stronger rather than weaker. American industry produced aircraft, weapons, and trained personnel in quantities that Japanese planners had not anticipated or prepared for. The Betty bomber became a symbol of Japanese willingness to accept catastrophic casualties in pursuit of tactical advantage. It became evidence of a military culture that valued mission accomplishment over crew survival, that treated personnel as expendable resources rather than valuable assets requiring protection. When American engineers examined the intact Betty at Clark Field, they were not just analyzing an enemy aircraft's technical specifications. They were witnessing the physical manifestation of choices made years earlier. Choices that prioritized capability over survival. Choices that accepted known vulnerabilities in exchange for performance advantages. Choices that would cost thousands of Japanese aircrew their lives over 4 years of brutal combat. The unprotected fuel tanks were not an accident of design. They were not an oversight by careless engineers. They were not a temporary measure pending better solutions. They were a conscious decision made by skilled engineers who understood the risks and accepted them because they believed the performance advantages justified the human cost. That belief proved catastrophically wrong, but the aircraft they designed embodied that belief in every rivet and fuel line. The Betty bomber served from the first day of the Pacific War to the last, from the attack on Clark Field in December 1941 to the surrender flights in August 1945. It sank capital ships and devastated air bases in the war's opening months. It ranged across distances no other bomber could match throughout the conflict. It represented Japanese aviation engineering at both its most impressive and most tragic. But its ultimate legacy is written not in its impressive specifications or its early successes, but in loss statistics that exceeded all projections. The aircraft that opened the war by destroying American air power at Clark Field ended the war carrying Japan's surrender delegation in white-painted aircraft marked with green crosses. The transformation from fearsome weapon to symbol of defeat encapsulated Japan's experience in the Pacific War. The crew of the captured bomber at Clark Field had abandoned their aircraft during the American advance. They had survived by walking away from an aircraft whose design made survival in combat nearly impossible. They made the right choice. Most Betty crews were not so fortunate. They flew missions knowing the danger. They climbed into unprotected bombers with exposed fuel tanks and minimal armor. They crossed vast Pacific distances to strike targets hundreds or thousands of miles from their bases. And they died in overwhelming numbers, consumed by fires that the aircraft's design made inevitable whenever combat damage occurred. The Betty bomber's story is ultimately about the price of capability without protection. It demonstrates that performance alone cannot guarantee success when that performance is purchased at the cost of crew survival. The extraordinary range meant nothing when aircraft could not survive the final distance to target. The impressive speed provided no advantage when American fighters could intercept with warning from radar systems and longer-range aircraft of their own. The payload capacity became irrelevant when formations were destroyed before weapon release. Most importantly, the Betty reveals the consequences of military technology designed without realistic assessment of combat conditions. The assumptions underlying the Betty's design proved catastrophically wrong within months of the Pacific War's start. By the time these assumptions were proven false, thousands of Betty bombers were already in service or production, and Japanese industry lacked the capacity to replace them with better protected designs. Japanese designers understood the risks when they made their choices in 1937 and 1938. They calculated the weight penalties of protection systems. They knew the vulnerabilities unprotected fuel tanks would create. They accepted the trade-offs because they believed the performance advantages would prove decisive in the war they anticipated fighting. They were wrong, and thousands of men paid the price for that miscalculation with their lives. If you found this story compelling and want to hear more accounts from history that reveal the human cost of design decisions and military strategy, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this tragic aircraft. Your support helps us bring more of these important stories to light. Thanks for watching.